Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Mem Zayin begins the fifth parak of the Masechta, parak Hoitziuloi. The Mishnah begins by discussing the next step in the process of the Avoda on Yom Kippur, which was the bringing of the Ketores into the Kodesh Kodashim, and it discusses and describes how the Kohen filled up his handfuls of Ketores. The Gemara will analyze exactly how he did it, what tools he used, which hand he held the shovel and the spoon in. The Gemara will take a slight detour to talk about Kimchis, the famous mother of Kohanim Gedolim. The Gemara will discuss if he's allowed to use a kli or if he has to use his hands. Then the Gemara will sidestep into a discussion of the halachos of Kemitza. Kemitza is another place where you find a sort of a handful, more like a fistful, that's taken of flour from a carbon mincha. And the Gemara will compare that to this avoda of taking handfuls of ketores. The Gemara will end off with a list of shailas, questions that remain unresolved about Kemitza and about this procedure. So let's begin. The Mishnah says that after the Kohen Gadol took their shovelful of coals, so they brought him a shovel and a spoon. The Gemara explains the shovel was not a shovelful for the coals. He already did that step. This was a shovelful of ketores, which came from the room where ketores is prepared, the lishkas beis aftinis. And the Kohen Gadol would then take he would scoop 2 handfuls of ketores in both hands. The 2 hands together, he would scoop 2 handfuls, and that's called a chayfin. Chayfin means a fistful. He took 2 open handfuls of ketores in his hands. The term, as described in the Psukim, is that he should take meloi chafnav, filled hands. So he takes filled hands of ketores and he puts it into the spoon. Now, how much ketores should he take? So 2 handfuls, depending on the size of the Kohen Gadol's hands, that's how much he took. There was no set amount. It varied by the Kohen and their hands. Then, once he had the ketores in the spoon, he would go and he would take the shovelful of coals in his right hand and the spoonful of ketores in his left hand. So the Gemara asks, why does he have a spoon? Who said anything about a spoon? The Torah, when it describes the avodah, doesn't talk about a spoon. It says he should take handfuls of ketores and bring it in. Where does the spoon come from? So the Gemara says he has to have a spoon, because otherwise, how's he going to carry the shovel? The shovel with the coals. How's he going to do that if both hands are filled with ketores? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Why can't he bring it in shifts? Let him first bring in the shovel full of coals and leave that in the Kodesh Kodashim and come back and get the ketores. So the Gemara says, no, the Torah doesn't talk about shifts. The Torah says that you should bring them both at the same time. It says, you should take a shovelful of coals and ketores, and then he should bring it in like that. So obviously they both have to be brought in the same time. So Gemara says, well, maybe he should first fill his hands with ketores and have the shovelful of coals be placed on top of that ketores. It won't burn his hands. So Gemara says, if that's what he does, what's he going to do when he gets there? He's going to have the shovel on top of the ketores, on top of his hands. How's he going to transfer the shovelful onto the place where it has to rest and then put the ketores on top of that? You won't be able to do that. Both hands are occupied. So Gemara says maybe he could use his teeth. Gemara says in front of a king of flesh and blood, you would not do avodah with your teeth. In front of the king, Melech HaMelech Baruch Hu, you're certainly not going to do your teeth. Therefore, we derive he should use a spoon. And the spoon, we've seen, it's not like we're making this up. When the Nesiim brought ketores, the Nesiim brought it in a spoon. So it says kaf achas. Melea ketores. So you see that you're allowed to use a spoon to bring ketores, and therefore that's what we assume that we're supposed to do, and that's the drasha that we learn from here. Okay, next the Gemara wants to know why is the coals in the right hand and the spoon in the left hand. The right hand is more chashiv, and the coals are less chashiv, so the coals should be in the left hand. So the Gemara says simply because the coals are heavier, and most people are right-handed. The Kohen Gadol was right-handed, and therefore he carried the coals in his right hand, so it's a little bit stronger. The Gemara says once this is the halacha, even if they are the same weight, like for example, if you have a Kohen with very large hands, and his handfuls hold 3 kav of ketores, just like the shovelful held 3 kav of coals, Even if it's the same weight, you still do it this way because this is the way you do it. The coals go in the right hand. So Gemara brings examples of Kahanim Gedolim that had large hands. Gemara says that they said about Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis. Shmuel was a Kohen Gadol. His mother's name was Kimchis. That his hands held 4 kavin of whatever it is, and they therefore held 4 kavin of kitoris, even more than the coals in the shovel, which were only 3 kavin according to most opinions. The Gemara says Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchas used to say that all women have zered, but my mother's zered was greater than all of them. So what's he referring to? So Zamachok is what it means. Either it's referring to a special wheat-based food that pregnant women like to eat, and she apparently had a very high quality zered, and that's why he came out with such large hands, and probably the rest of him was also proportional. Or it's referring to the zera of the father, that it's the mother's work to separate out the healthiest seed, and his mother separated out the greatest of the seeds, and that's why he came out in such wonderful condition. The Gemara says that as far as separating out the seed, you have psukim in Tehillim and in Shmuel that seem to indicate these 2 steps. The same pasuk, almost identical, appears in Tehillim Chav Beis and in Tehillim Yud Ches. It's a shira of David HaMelech. The difference is that in Shmuel it says Vatazreini Chayil HaMelchama, and in Tehillim it says Vati'azreini Chayil HaMelchama. So the Gemara explains Vatazreini is like winnowing, that Hashem has the mother select the greatest seed from them all, and then it's Vati'azreini, then you strengthen me based on choosing the strongest of the seed that there was. Now the Gemara says that the Rabbi Shua ben Kimchis, once we're discussing Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis, once we are discussing him, once spoke to an Arab in the street, and a bit of spittle flew on him, and therefore he became Talmei, and therefore his brother Yeshivav was Kohen Gadol for that day in place of him, and their mother had 2 Kohanim Gedolim at the same time. A different time, Rabbi Shmuel ben Kimchis was talking to somebody else in the street, and another piece of spittle flew on him, and again he became Tamei, and this time a different brother served instead of him, and that was his brother Yosef. So Gemara says that again his mother had 2 Kohanim Gedolim at the same time. Now we have a brisa that says that Kimchis actually had 7 sons who served as Kohanim Gedolim at some point during their lives. And the Chachamim asked her, "What did you do to have this great merit to have 7 children serve as Kohanim Gedolim?" The Rishonim explain not that one died and the other one took over, because that wouldn't be a bracha, but they replaced each other because of psulim at various times. So the Gemara says she answered and she said, "Because the walls of my home never saw the braids of my hair." The Rishonim add in when they were possible or okay to cover them. And the Chachamim answered and said that can't be the reason, because many people did that and they did not have the tremendous chesed that you have of having so many children be Kohanim Gedolim. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to compare Chafina and Kfitza. Chafina is this avoda which we are discussing of taking handfuls of ketores. Kmitza is related to a carbon mincha, which is brought from flour or other crumbled breadcrumbs, depending on what the carbon is. The way that avoda worked was that the Kohen would scoop in his 3 middle fingers of his hand. He would scoop and he would fold into between his fingers and the palm of his hand. He would fold a kind of small fistful of that flour, and that would be called a kmitza. That was like slaughtering of an animal carbon. That kmitza would go on the mizbeach, just like pieces of the animal carbon went on the mizbeach, and the rest, what's left over, would be called shirayim, just like the parts of animal karbanos, depending which carbon it is, could be eaten afterwards. That's the shirayim that does not go on the mizbeach. The leftover flour is also shirayim, and again, depending what carbon mincha it is, it could possibly be eaten. But every carbon has the part that goes on the mizbeach and has the shirayim. The emurim of animals go on the mizbeach, and the rest is shirayim, again for most karbanos. And the emurim of a carbon mincha and the kmitza of a carbon mincha goes on the mizbeach. That's this 3-finger handful, and the rest are called shirayim. At least for most carbon minchas, there are some that are burned completely. So the Gemara discusses how this kmitza works and compares it to chafina. They're both scoopfuls, and that'll be the topic for the rest of the daf. So the Gemara first brings a brisa that says that when you do kmitza, you cannot use a kli. You have to do it with your hands. How do you know? Because when the Torah describes it, it says bikumtzai. It has to be in his kaimitz, in his closed fingers. The Gemara says, what about chafina? Are you allowed to use a kli to make the handfuls of ketoris? It doesn't say bichafnav in his chayfin. It just says meloi chafnav, handfuls. Maybe it should be, that's a measure, it should be his handfuls, but he's allowed to make a kli that size and use that. He doesn't have to actually use his hands. So Gemara says, well, if you look at the Mishnah carefully, it seems to indicate that he is allowed to use a measure, because when it says that he used to do it whatever size hands he had, it says v'kach hoisa midasa, and this is how the measure was. That seems to imply that he could make a measuring kli that size if he wanted. Versus not, when it says then that's what the measure was, doesn't necessarily mean that he could do it differently in a kli with that measure. It could mean that when he went into the Kodesh Kodashim, now he had to transfer from the spoon back into his hands. He does the same chafina, he does the same amount that's now going into his hands, because he has to transfer it back into his hands and place it on the coals from his hands. So that's a second chavina that has to be done, and the Mishnah just means to say that the first chavina is the same as the second one. You cannot add any ketoris, and you can't be missing any ketoris. So therefore, since we don't know exactly what the Mishnah means, we don't have a proof from that. Okay, the Gemara now brings another brisa. The brisa discusses more in detail the halacha of the kaimetz, and it also learns something from the word bikumtzai. What does it say? It says you have to take a kaimetz, and you should not have other flour hanging around on your hand, on the top of the hand, on the sides of the hand. Anything that sticks on is not part of the kaimetz. How do you know? Because it says bikumtzai. What you're actually bringing as a kaimetz has to be in your kaimetz, in your folded fingers. Anything extra has to be removed. So the Gemara says, what do you do? So you take 3 fingers and you fold the 3 fingers into the hand. You cannot just take the fingertips and fold the fingertips. That's not enough. It's got to be more than that. How do you know? Because it says miloi kumtzai. It says you should take a full kaimetz. So now we see between the two things. It says big kumtzai, it should be in his kaimetz and not anything extra hanging around. And it should be miloi kumtzai, a full kaimetz, not just part of the kaimetz. And that is the proper amount that you're supposed to do. Now, the Brisa says that if it's a sticky kind of powder, like it's not fine flour, it's ground up bread crumbs, which are sometimes used, or matzah crumbs. So then it's harder to have nothing else hanging on. So you have to actually use the thumb and the pinky finger to rub the edges of the 3 middle fingers to wipe off any extra material that's hanging on there that should not included and should not go on the mizbeach itself. And you should only have an exact 3-finger fold. The Brisa ends off and says, this is the hardest avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara says, this is the hardest avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. What do you mean? We've said in other Mishnahs that Malika, severing simanim, only rove and not more of a bird, a carbon, olas ofa, or chatas ofa. That's the hardest avodah. Not only that, but when he has to transfer the spoonful of ketoris into his hands in the Kodesh Kodashim, that's extremely difficult. He has to transfer it into both hands at the same time. What's he going to do with the spoon? That's also extremely difficult. What hand will he hold the spoon is? So the Gemara says, no, okay, so it's not the most difficult avodah. We just mean to say, the Brisa meant to say it is a very difficult avodah, but it's not necessarily the hardest one. Okay, now the Gemara has a question. What happens with the bits of flour that's stuck between the fingers? It's not in the handful. It's stuck between the fingers. It's on the outside of the handful, but it's caught. It's trapped between the fingers. What does that count as? So Gemara says, Rav Papa clarifies, anything which is outside the hand is not a shayla. That's definitely not a kaimetz, has to be gotten rid of. Anything which is inside the kaimetz is not a shayla. That definitely is a kaimetz, and it goes on the mizbeach. The question is something which is trapped between the fingers. So Gemara says it's a suffix. Our determination is that it's a suffix. We don't know if it goes in the mizbeach or not. So what should you do then? So Gemara says what you should do then is first put the regular kaimetz, the real kaimetz, on the mizbeach, burn that, and then put this on the mizbeach. It has to be in that order, because if you put this on the mizbeach first, then you're missing, then on the tzad that it's not kaimetz, on the tzad that it's supposed to be in the shirayim, you're missing part of your shirayim. And the halacha is you cannot put the kaimetz on the mizbeach if you lose part of the shirayim. The shirayim has to be fully there. So Gemara says, well, hold on a second. Even in your solution, that you put it on the mizbeach after you put the kaimetz on the mizbeach, is still a problem. You're not allowed to put shirayim on the mizbeach. It's aser. Anything which is not part of the kaimetz, not part of the matir, not part of the imurim of animals or the kaimetz of carbon mincha, is not allowed to go on the mizbeach. So Gemara says that's not a problem. I'll put it on the mizbech like this. I'll make it tonight. I'll say that if this is part of the kaimitz, I'm putting it on as a haktara, as a burning of karbonis. If it's not part of the kaimitz, I'm just giving it as wood. You're allowed to put wood in the fire anytime you want, so I'm adding this b'teiras wood. It's not actually wood, but it's there just to fuel the fire. Gemara says you find a similar thing about animal karbonis. It sometimes happens that you have limbs of animals, you don't know if they go on the mizbech or not. You have a carbon chatas whose limbs go on the mizbech, and you have a carbon chatas whose limbs do not go on the mizbech, and a carbon oila whose limbs do on the mizbech, and maybe they got mixed up with each other. So what are you supposed to do? So we have a mishnah where Rav Elazar says you put it on the mizbech as fuel. You say that if this is carbon oila, I'm putting on the mizbech as a carbon. If it's carbon chatas, I'm putting it on the mizbech as fuel. You're allowed to do that. So Gemara says that's good according to Rabbi Eliezer, but the Rabbanan disagree and say you can't do that. So what's the solution according to them? So Gemara answers that the Rabbanan will just say that you have to be very careful not to get stuck in a situation like this because you won't know what to do with that extra flour trapped between the fingers. Therefore, the only people who should do kamitza are fat kahanim, who have fleshy fingers, and that way there'll be nothing that'll get stuck between the fingers. There won't be any gaps or spaces between the fingers. Everything will either be inside the kaimitz or outside the kaimitz itself. The Gemara now introduces a long list of shailas. Asked by Rav Papa about the kamitza of Karban Mincha and the chafina of Ketores, and the comparison between the two and what halachas you learn one from the other, and most of these shailas will not be answered. So the first question is, we've seen that what's trapped between your fingers, we don't know if that goes on the mizbeach or not, and therefore we have to come up with some solution. The Gemara says, what about what's trapped between your hands? When you're doing chafina of Ketores, what about what's trapped between your hands? So the Gemara says, I don't understand the question. We already said that the halachos of chafina and ketores, and kamitza of the karban and mincha are learned one from the other, by way of gzeira shava between the two. They both use the word malei. The word malei appears in psukim about both chafina malei chafnav, and in a different pasuk it says miloi kumtzai. So they both use the word miloi. And therefore we learn one from the other, and we'd applied this earlier to say that just like you can't use a kli for a kaimitz, you can't use a kli for chafina. At least that was one tzad that we had. So Gemara says with the kli halacha is learned from the word bikum tzoi, that it says by kamitza. You apply that via the gzeira shava of malei to chafina. That chafina also you can't use a kli because it should also be like bikum tzoi. So Gemara says the word bikum tzoi is also the source that you can't have anything outside your actual fistful. So then the word bikum tzoi, the same gzeira shava from the same word, should also tell you that by chafina you can't have anything outside your handful, and you have to have only what's in the hands and not what's trapped between the skin of the two hands. So Gemara says that Rav Papa's question was maybe you could learn this halacha from elsewhere. If you look at the words of the psukim, the pasuk that describes chafina, it says v'lokach, he should take, and it talks about the coals, and then right afterwards it refers to the chafina. It says malay chafin of ketores samim vehevi. He should do a v'lokach and a vehevi on the ketores. Now v'lokach means he should take. What ends up trapped between his hands wasn't taken. He didn't take that. It just kind of ended up there by itself. So what's trapped between the fingers, between the hands, doesn't count as a v'lokach. However, it is a vehevi, because now that it's there, he's going to bring it with him into the Kodesh Kedashim, so he's doing a vehevi. So the question is, how do we learn the psukim? The material that's trapped between the hands, it counts as a vehevi, and it doesn't count as a velakach. So which one is exclusive? Which is the correct one he's supposed to do? And therefore, could we say whether or not it counts, and you should be bringing it as ketoras? The Gemara says, take it, we don't know the answer to that question, we're going to leave it. Now Rav Papa has a list of questions about how you do kamitza exactly. So Rav Papa says, I know the correct way to do it is to have your hand sideways, the side of the hand downward, put it into the flour, and scoop 3 fingers up. My question is, what about other ways of doing it? What if you just use your fingertips to scoop the flour into your hands until the hand is full? Not like we said earlier, we know that you can't just use a fingertip full, but maybe you could use it to scoop it into your hands. Or maybe you'll put your hands, you'll stick it into the flour and scoop upwards. Could you do that? What about if you do a sideways scoop? That's you run your hand sideways across the top of the flour until you've plowed almost an entire scoopful into your hand. Does that count? So Gemara says a teiko on all of these. Now, Rav Papa has similar questions about chafina. When you fill your hands with the flour, with the ketores, to bring into the Kodesh Kodashim. So we know the right way to do it is to put the side of your hand into the ketores heap and take 2 scoopfuls like that. So Papa says, what if you stick the fingertips into the heap? What happens if you do that? What if you stick your hands sideways? You have the heap heaped up, and you stick it sideways into the heap. What if you stick your hand, you sweep it into your fingers from scoopfuls from top to the bottom? What's the halacha over there? All these questions are asked. What if you take one handful in each hand and then bring the 2 hands together? You don't do both hands at the same time. All these, again, remain.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.